And eventually, when she's already a young adult, she runs into the work of a Russian scientist talking about how he feels because he had a war wound in his brain and it caused him to have similar reactions to her. And she thought, oh my God, here's somebody who apparently is intelligent and living, more or less well, but he also has what I have. So, long story short, because you could say she began to have hope that there was something she could do to become the way she should be, brain-wise. So she started doing exercises. First, very simple things. She got her clock out, but bear in mind, she's now a young adult. She got her clock out, worked with the two hands, and just practiced and practiced and practiced until her brain, like we said earlier, what you do most often is what you do best. Until her brain figured out that this meant 3:30 or that meant, 12:45. And then she added extra hands. She added the second hand and I don't know what other hand she added in. And then she started doing another kind of exercise. And again, long story short, and then she picked up a bunch of philosophy books. So she was capable of reading. But if Jane and Tom are playing with the dog. But she was not capable of understanding concepts such as philosophical ones. And for some reason, she came into a bunch of philosophy books one day when she was still in the early stages of retraining her brain, or training it newly. And the books she found were all philosophy. And she thought, I'll never understand this. So she picks up the first book, reads a page. It made sense, because something had already begun to change. And another page and another page. Well, she read the whole library. And then because she was by now doing things normally and thinking normally and being able to talk normally and all the things you can imagine that you and I take for granted, she has opened a school, and more than one. I think she's got some in Australia. The woman is Canadian. For children with some kind of learning disability that goes beyond the typical stuff schools deal with. And the kids that come out of her schools, all good. There's in one of her talks, I can't remember if it's in one of the talks or if it's in the book, she shows a page of one of the children who is asked to write for 10 minutes about a given subject. And the sheet shows a few scribbles here, another couple scribbles here, and lots of empty space. A year later, after having gone through her program, the child is asked to do that again, whole page full, actually 3 pages, full of writing, because of the neuroplasticity of the brain and the having trained the brain to work in other ways. Now, here we have another example of a...
Excuse me. Does that work with dyslexia also? I've heard some cases that if the children train and train and train, then they can read, they can see. Does that?
I cannot tell you that because I haven't actually read specific cases, but what I can tell you is that the younger a child is and begins to practice, the greater the possibilities are that they will read normally.
Yeah. Can I add to that, because I have a dyslexic child?
Yes.
She, of course, an adult now. But when we discovered her dyslexia, she was around 7 years old. I'm in New York, and I did some investigatory with Hofstra University and through them, and I found a therapist who used a multi-sensory approach. In other words, sight, sound, and touch. She saw, she heard, she wrote. And now she is absolutely just an ordinary reader and is a beautiful writer.
But you know that
school was a very important thing to write well.
And you know the visual spatial aspect of it
Multisensory.
is absolutely important, as we'll see a little bit later in another example, because I'm amazed. So your daughter is how old now?
How old is she now? She's 38.
38. So this is 31 years ago.
She was 7 years old.
31 years ago, the world was not thinking in these terms. So you found a really special human being.
Yeah, and I also went to Hofstra University, because the school I had her in would not accept that she had difficulties. And so when they did the test for special ed, for special assistance, they said, oh, she's just on the line.
Yes.
And I refused to accept that because I saw her in other ways being very productive. As a, you know, and so then I went to Hofstra. I contacted Hofstra because they were running, they had a program, because they had a school teaching, you know, and I went to them, and I was a graduate of Hofstra.
Thank you. That's very, very interesting. I'm going to look into that about dyslexia
Okay.
because I have so little information about dyslexia. Okay, next, sorry, go ahead.
Could you apply your practice to forgetfulness, to not be able to recall names at times or make sentences? Could you have a training for that kind of...
So I don't know if you all understood if I have some kind of training or a practice force.
Yeah, so the neuroplasticity
Yes.
would go ahead.
I understand, but the problem is that is not my line of work.
Oh.
I use this information for my line of work, but what you are describing requires somebody more specialized, a little bit even in what the lady before was saying. So you're talking about a multisensorial approach to memory, assuming that the memory has not been affected by amyloid, you know, tissue in the brain, which means we're in Alzheimer's. But if it is not that, if it is something different, then yes, memory is amenable to certain kinds of training, but you would need to find somebody who's working on that. I would say hunt and hunt and hunt in Google. Whether you find somebody in America or here in Spain or in England, you know, there is bound to be somebody.
Yeah, but your theory of neuroplasticity does not cover the area of training your brain to kind of start remembering things that suddenly you are forgetting.
No, first of all, it's not my theory of neuroplasticity, but that which I'm describing.
Right.
Yes, but I'm sure if you look hard enough, you will find. But in everything I have read, I have not yet come across that. But you know, I will continue. And if Heather knows who you are, if I find something, I'll tell Heather to let you know.
Well, I think after old age, in a sense, when you are young, you kind of more
Yes.
with it.
Yes.
You know, you can lose your things.
Okay, so this next book is about a guy called Clark Elliott, and the book is actually called The Ghost in the Brain, How a Concussion Stole My Life and How the New Science of Brain Plasticity Helped Me Get It Back. Well, the story is absolutely incredible. He also, when he was beginning his healing part, had just run into Norman Doidge's book. And thanks to that book, he looked for a whole other kind of person to help him, as opposed to the people who for 10 years had been telling him, you can just write yourself off. What happened to him was, he was already in his 40s, and he was at a stoplight, and he was rear-ended. And in the rear-ending, his head went back to his headrest, forward, but without hitting itself on anything other than the headrest. But it was this rapid movement that caused what we were going to call the brain concussion. And although at first glance it looked like all was well, it wasn't. And he started noticing things very, very quickly. At times he was totally unable to walk. He had to crawl. Sometimes the only way he was able to do it walking was by holding on to walls. This is a university professor, by the way, who had sole custody of his children, 5 children, and who needed to continue working in order to make money, to pay the mortgage, the kids for schools and food and so on and so forth. For 10 years, at times not being able to walk, unable to multitask, had no balance, could often not even say the names of his 5 children. At one point, things were so bad that he was about to lose the custody, he was about to lose his house, and about to become a ward of the state. All his doctors, he apparently went to doctor after doctor after doctor. He spent a fortune going to doctors to try and fix himself. Nobody gave him any hope, not even a bit. So then he read the first of the two Deutsch books. And he began to research neuroplasticity. And what he found was, he lived in Chicago, and he found one specialist in cognitive restructuring. Now, that may be something you, lady at the back, might want to look into. Cognitive restructuring, in his case, became extremely important. I'll tell you about it in a second. And he found an optometrist. Now, he didn't have a question of poor vision, so this wasn't about that. But the cognitive restructuring specialist said to him, you need to go see this particular optometrist, also in Chicago, who emphasizes neurodevelopmental techniques. Like a guy who has forgotten how to use his brain, we could say that that is part of the business. So the first thing that happened, first, the cognitive restructuring lady, they were both ladies, took a bunch of exams of his and said, okay, I need to study this now. But then she sent him to this optometrist, and the optometrist had him do several tests, and then she put some special glasses on him. The way he describes it in the book is, thrilling and chilling and mind-boggling. It is wonderful. Immediately, some things changed, and this goes to visual, spatial cognition. Why would the glasses make things change? Because of the way his eyes react to them and the way the eyes have to do with our cognition. Anyway, he wore those, I think he wore them for the first month, those glasses. And the next day he went back to the first lady, the cognitive restructuring specialist, and she said to him, I think I can fix you. Start by doing these exercises. And she gave him a piece of paper with, like an L, but with little dots. And he had to join the dots. And he thought to himself, hello, I'm this university professor, what am I doing joining these dots? But he was so out of hope and so out of anything that he said, I will do whatever they tell me to do. So he did these little join the dots, he did more complicated join the dots, and he says, after only 1 month doing the join the dots and the new glasses, he was 70 to 80% fixed. And then roughly another 6 months, I think, and he was fully fixed. After 10 years, of all the specialists he went to, neurologists, you name it, he went to all the doctors he could think of. They all told him, there's no hope. And yet there was. And it depended on neuroplasticity. What they did was change his brain. So again, neuroplasticity, you take this message home with you, please. Remember, it can change your brain. It doesn't matter really what it is. At least give it a heck of a shot before you give up on yourself for whatever thing you have. And probably none of you have anything as bad as what I'm describing here. You have other things that affect more your way of thinking, your way of living, your emotions, and so on. Okay, the last of these examples is Susan Berry, who, the book is called Fixing My Gaze, and she was born with crossed eyes. And as you may know, when your eyes are crossed, you don't see in 3D. Because the eyes don't focus on something properly, you see monovision. You see what one eye shows you. If your eye do this, I now see in so-called monovision. But because of all the information I have stored over the many years of my life, if I do this, I still think I'm seeing in 3D because I can fill in the bits that this eye isn't showing me. But if I'm born with flat monovision because I have crossed eyes, there is, according to science, up to when this little girl was born, only one way to fix it, and that is by correcting the crossed eye aspect of her eyes. And they did that. She actually had 3 operations. But for who knows what reason, I think in the book she says it was because it was done a bit too late. But for whatever the reason,